goodness. How are you doing, Dr. Simpkin? You doing okay?
Yeah, how are you,
I am
Daniel?
doing well. It's so good to see you. How's work, Dimitri? Good to see you. Your book is coming out, yes? When, how, and you got like a mini book tour and everything?
Yeah, I just thought I'd drop by. I don't know what the format is.
We actually don't know the format, Dr. Simpkin. We just talk and see what happens. But how is that going for you, sir?
Yeah, I'm just had my book out about ballistic missile defense, and I've been on a short tour around various different places. So I thought I'd just drop by this evening to see what you're all chatting about, and see if I can contribute at all.
Well, you are a gentleman, sir. And everyone, Dr. Simpkin's work is fantastic. Micro Liberations, the blog, I believe, and I've had a wonderful discussion with Mr. Simpkin on his work. And Ryan, it's good to see you as well. And Michelle, we've been talking recently, Mr. Simpkin, and about AI, artificial intelligence, like how that affects us. Mr. Ebert last time, Alex, left on, we were kind of talking about this weird thing where AI may leave it to where like we go back to say like manual labor, blue collar work and different things, and how there might be this irony where we end up, where you're like, oh, go to college and have a job and you'll have a success. And it ends up the first jobs that are taken is AI, and all the people who like didn't go to college will still have jobs. And these kind of interesting ways in which these things are unfolding. And Dr. Cadell last had a fascinating discussion on the psychoanalysis of AI and artificial intelligence. And I actually recently listened to that conversation on artificial intelligence in the military strategy. I think the CCI, that was a really fascinating discussion, and how the people in the military were like, no, we come up with technology too. It's not just civilians on the outside who come in. That was very fascinating to listen to that. So we've been talking about that. But Michelle, I know we had been talking about some of the different things and some of the questions that you had from last time.
So yeah, I was thinking about just the fact that, like, thinking about what Ebert had brought up. Sorry, just a minute. My our littlest one needs help. But basically, just the idea that why blue collar work might actually be safe is because it's so hard to program robots for the uncertainties of physical spaces, right? Like you've got a robot that works really well for this certain space or whatever, and then suddenly somebody puts a box where there isn't usually a box, and now the robot's just like just kind of like getting completely hung up on something. So it's very difficult. The phenomenological space presents like a real difficulty for AI and for like the virtual world at large. But like in some ways that might be the saving grace of the phenomenological, right, and like the physical spaces, because it's weird. It's actually the kind of almost like the minutia of the quotidian that robots might have a hard time doing because it's so unexpected and impromptu. And so anyways, I just think that's really fascinating because a lot of our mindset is like, oh, the Jetsons and conveyor belts and stuff, like they'll just take over all of our physical jobs, but probably not. So yeah.
And no, it's very interesting because kind of in your mind, when you think of what jobs are secure and what jobs are not secure, you end up going, oh, since the best paying jobs are being a law clerk or working in computer programming or going to Wall Street, in your head you go, oh, those are the secure jobs, right? Those are the jobs that are going to do well. When actually it is far more difficult to program a robot that can even just clean a kitchen as opposed to find an algorithm that's going to trade stocks well. And that is so counterintuitive to what we're used to, because we've basically been trained, oh, if you go to college and have these jobs, they'll pay more and you'll be secure. But you could have this radical reversal that might be cognitively quite difficult for people to handle. It's also ironic, though, because it's kind of funny. I was saying to Ebert last night, there's so much emphasis today on getting back to the body, being embodied. Well, AI may actually go a long way to forcing that, because you have to get back to thinking in terms of the everydayness. And there's a few things with it. There are some spiritual, like there's that old Buddhist parable that will talk about, there's this guy who comes to the teacher and he says, teacher, I'd like to be your student. And the teacher said, okay, well, first you need to wash these dishes. And the student says, okay, and he washes the dishes. And another day goes by and he washes the dishes and he washes the dishes. And after 3 months, one day the teacher gets pissed. The student gets mad. He throws the plate and he's like, you've been telling me to wash dishes and I've been washing dishes for 3 months and you still won't teach me. And the teacher's like, no, you never washed the dishes. All you ever did was wobble. You never actually wash the dishes. And there's this notion that one of the reasons there's a certain spiritual depletion or depletion in life is precisely that people are not actually in their everyday lives, right? Like they're not actually present in their experiences. And when they do tasks like taking care of a garden or washing dishes, they're just trying to get through it, right? They're not actually present in it. And they're, and to try to take every side of this, because we've talked a bit on how forced Landry is basically like AI is going to kill us all because it can't be alive. But then there are other sides of it that are like, no, let's not be a doomsayer where AI is going to kill us all because, that's too easy, right? So it's interesting to look at on every side. And there's one part of it that wonders, is AI actually almost going to force a certain spiritual practice of making us prioritize actually finding enjoyment in, say, these physical tasks that AI will not be able to replace as well. And maybe that would be good for us, right? Maybe that would be something that would help us. Like right now, there's so much of the disembodied, the mental health crisis, all these different things. Maybe a part of that is because we don't have the ability to be fully embodied in our present moment. And maybe AI could help with that, assuming that AI doesn't cause mass, economic hysteria because everyone loses their jobs or different things like that. So those are some thoughts. I'll give it to Dimitri. Good to see you, sir.
Yeah, good to see you as well. Good to be here. This notion of disembodiment and embodiment, they are interesting. In Lacanian analysis, you cannot find such notions. They would entail different modes of jouissance, of enjoyment, different ways of having unconscious patterns, compulsive repetitions that you are acting out, but you don't know that you are acting them out. Of course, as a neurotic goes to psychoanalysis, he basically demands of his analyst to cure him, but to keep his mode of enjoyment. So he basically wants to have his cake and eat it. Now, of course, the big joke is that that's impossible, and that he has to live with his symptom, and that all you can basically do is have different formations of symptoms. And so you can now the spiritual path is one of the means to do this. I've experienced with tantra and psychedelic settings, and these are places where you can experiment with modes of enjoyment that you've never encountered before in a tantric space or a psychedelic space. Or also just like a simple psychoanalytical setting, or what we are doing, as intellectuals, like reading books, writing. That's a special kind of symptom that I was talking about with Michelle. That for Lacan, there's no such thing as a will to know or a will to learn, because it's actually there's a fundamental incuriosity. You will always repress the content of your unconscious and its sexual and aggressive tendencies, and your curiosity itself is a symptom of that. So it comes secondary, and there's a fundamental incuriosity, and you will always dismiss, look away, critique, or whatever, flee from yourself when you come too close to the thing itself, or das Ding, like Lacan would say. Now, to go back to the notion of embodiment and disembodiment, well, what's really, really happening here? Well, there's Alexander Barth, who critiques Plato for being a dualist, right? He's stuck with his own fantasies. He's autistic. There is no such hinterwelt, or like Nietzsche says as well. So you can say that is disembodied. That would make sense. Well, when we start reading Hegel, he also talks in this kind of what you could call a Platonist way, where he kind of critiques this mere occupation with the senses, right? And this is a trend you see in the whole Neoplatonist tradition as well. You have to they don't say you have to be completely ascetic like Plotinus or Iamblichus, but you do have to change your relation to food, to sex, and to those primal drives, to that sensory world. Well, we don't want that, because why would we? We love food and we love sex. Well, if you can be with the negativity of reflective labor as an intellectual, really tarry with questions of fundamental truth that are relevant in your own life, and using metaphysical notions like love, the soul, the heart, yeah, you can make huge mistakes by like thinking ideas and acting them out, right? So now I'm not sure like if I have no, I don't I'm sure that I don't have an answer on how this whole and disembodied and embodied thing works. I do think that the notion of presence, I generally like the notion of presence, and I also like what comes up with Plotinus in the Neoplatonist tradition, that it's about developing a kind of yeah, pure simplicity of being. I think that's one of the ways to put it. It's like to release or detach yourself from I guess contingent particularity, like, you know, an addiction to some kind of drug or a food or whatever kind of neurotic ritual you have. So I don't think like if you I think Hegel is someone who's like somewhat like it's some kind of extension of the Neoplatonist tradition in some kind of sense, you know, going along with Christian mysticism as well. So I don't think like philosophy in general is about like complexification, but like the whole drama about philosophy is the simplicity of the moment, right? And that's like what Hegel wants us to work with, the simplicity of the notion self-othering in logical moments, through negation and negation of the negation. Now, to be present with that in your own life and not only in the books, to apply Hegel in your own life, I think this is, you can call this embodiment, but it seems to go through a certain kind of disembodiment. I don't know. I'm just kind of like freely associating on what I think. Yeah, where these notions.
No, the associational logic is what. No, you've said a bunch of things that are very interesting, and then I'll pass it to whoever wants to speak. Like you could ask the question: are we disembodied right now in this conversation? Right? Maybe if I were to use the wash machine to people 200 years ago, they'd be like, "You're disembodied because you're not doing the physical labor of the hand." Right? There's almost something about embodied versus disembodied, which may be an inadequate language. Maybe we need to talk about in relational, like are you in relation or not in relation? Like embodied, EMREA, like relational. The other thing too, to your points, like for David Hume, if you stay embodied and never go on the philosophical journey, if you stay in the common life, you're susceptible to Hannah Arendt's banality of evil. But if you go on the philosophical journey and go into abstract reasoning and stay there, you can become a terror because you try to create the world in your image, you know, your ideas, and not go back to it. So you have to return to common life. And return is interesting because it's like the RE in parentheses, like in Hegel. Return is never return, right? Every return is a sort of making new. So what will it mean to return to the body or the presence after AI? Like being embodied, if we just grant that language, although I agree with you, there might be some problem with that. It's almost like you have embodiment before AI and then embodiment after AI. Is there a difference? What does that look like? I'll also note simple is an interesting word because in theology, God is simple, but that doesn't mean like, it means like there's no composite parts. Like there's a many that somehow shares an essence. So what would it mean for humans to be simple, but not simplistic? Seems to be different. I'll also note on the psychoanalysis stuff, I was joking with Cadell the other day, where it's like, I wonder if Kurt Gödel became like a mathematical Platonist because he didn't want to go to a wedding. You know, like going to a wedding is like, you're like, I don't want to go, so let me come up with a theory of the universe that makes math and seclusion like the quickest way to get to truth, right? So there's always an investment of the subject in the technology or the theory. So what is the investment of the subject in AI, in ourselves in AI? And then Ryan made a very interesting point where he was saying in the comments that often our experience of time is relative to new information. Like if we have new information, things can speed up. Where old information, it can slow down. One of the whole points of like that Buddhist teaching, and then I'll give it to Dr. Simpkin, is the notion that precisely when you wash the dishes, you don't have new information. So new information, so you're forced to be in old information and somehow relate to it as if it's new information. That's the great challenge, right? Like how can you somehow experience because almost like new information could be a drug distracting you from your inability to experience the old information or the present in a manner that comes alive, or in terms of this theological simplicity we're describing. So is it something that AI and maybe forcing us to a place where all we can do is wash dishes, then we're really going to be forced to figure out how to experience that in a new way, or we'll just fall into endless boredom and uselessness, as Mr. Ebert was saying, which for Benjamin Fontaine leads to a lot of trouble. Like bored people, he kind of offhandedly in Existential Monday is like, you know what causes wars? Boredom. Do you know what causes like conflict? When people feel useless. So it's interesting to think of all those things together. But let me pass it on to Mr. Dr. Simpkin. Mr. Simpkin, again, it's always really good to see you. I've always enjoyed the opportunity. And I'll have you know, I was thinking about you the other day when the trolley problem came up. And I was like, with Justin and all them. I was like, yes, I spoke with Dr. Simpkin about this. So it's wonderful to see you, sir.
No, thank you very much for being here. And just to introduce myself, I'm James. I've known Daniel for quite a while and enjoyed his company on many a discussion and seeing his great discussions and articles. Yeah, and I was just dropping by because I've been working on a book which has come out recently called Labour's Ballistic Missile Defence Policy, 1997 to 2010. It's about ballistic missile defence. But this is why it's great coming on here, because you know, we get such a different cross-fertilization of ideas. I'm just relating this back to my own work and talking about embodied and disembodiment. I think this is where we can bring nuclear weapons into this argument, because perhaps nuclear weapons are one of the few technologies that causes elites and leaders, let alone populations, to be fully embodied to the risk of war. There's a lot of talk about game theory and AI, and the way in which, you know, world leaders can be protected to some degree from the consequences of starting wars because they're not the ones that are fighting on the front line. But in a very deep Clausewitzian sense, nuclear weapons still pose a real physical risk to leaders as much as civilians, because even if you're ensconced in NORAD, you know, that's not gonna, you could drop 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 nuclear bombs on NORAD and wipe it out. You know, the Russians have got over 1,000. So we might say that, you know, putting AI and all these fancy military technologies to one side, nuclear weapons still allow us, or still force us to be embodied, and our erstwhile leaders to be embodied to the risk of warfare, and therefore stay their hand.
That was really interesting, and it made me think. One of the problems that seems to be with like the modern economy is a lot of people who say favor globalization, white collar college people are not conscious of the impacts it has on like the manufacturing or the lower classes, like West Virginia, how that's been decimated. And really they've kind of been isolated from the impacts of technology on people's everyday lives and their economic well-doing. But now that AI is around, it's almost like the white collar people are like, oh, you're talking about a technology that might take my job? Oh, well, hold on, let's slow down now. Whereas when it was technologies that were taking all the manufacturing jobs and all the blue collar, you know, the people in those fields, or they were being automated, because it seems like there's this space between manufacturing that gets automated, or it doesn't get totally automated. The amount of workers you need drops like a rock, or some of the coal mining or different things. But then there also seems to be work that AI or robots won't do for a long time, which is like cleaning a house. It would seem like robots definitely can fill in if you have a guy on an assembly line doing the same task over and over again, that seems to be very easy to roboticize. However, when it comes to, say, cleaning your kitchen, because that actually entails a whole lot of skills all at once, that seems to be quite different. The point is, this is a very interesting point you raised, Dr. Simpkin, because maybe actually now it's almost like the classes will start to be unified to really think about how does technology affect us economically in our daily life, and maybe we need to be wiser about that in the same way that maybe nuclear wars has made the leaders go, maybe we don't want to be so quick to go into conflict because I don't want to get nuked. That's a very interesting thought, Dr. Simpkin.
And on the opposite side of that, just to bring in some, you know, if we're talking about embodiment on the opposite side, I'm reminded of Heidegger's quote about the abolition of distance brings no nearness. And on the opposite side, you know, we have the immense distances that nuclear weapons can travel, and you know, you can only plan to destroy millions of people if you are able to kill from that distance. But maybe, you know, that risk, that Clausewitzian risk, helps stay politicians' hands in starting warfare.
That's also very interesting because does AI close the distance between classes, like close us together where like, oh, we're human? Maybe it is. Now I'm thinking like Smith, like you unify nations by having a common enemy. Like there's AI. And so now all the rich, low, and middle classes will come together to really think about their condition versus the AI, which of course doesn't seem like the correct response. If it's mankind versus AI, that doesn't seem functional. So then it would be like, how do you sublate with it, to use that Hegelian term? But there's something about, does the AI increase distance or close distance relative to our humanity or between humans? Does it increase our closeness to everyday quotidian tasks because now it's like the only way our humanness can have an expression that AI can't take over? In what way does it increase distance or close distance? Because it would seem like with Heidegger, erasing distance didn't bring closeness, but maybe AI is different because it's intelligent, that it's like it's unique in that it's an intelligence as opposed to simply a wrench. Does artificial intelligence, and then I'll pass to whoever wants to speak, and then anyone can talk about anything. Does that close distance? Whereas every technology up to this point has seemingly, does it increase nearness? I mean, whereas most technologies up to this point have not increased nearness. Could there be a positive reversal? Or could it be an extremity, like a super making way worse the problem of not having nearness? And that would get into the nitty gritty. That's a very interesting question.
I'm not so sure what you mean by this nearness, because to me it seems like from trains to smartphones, they all increase nearness, right? Like
for Heidegger, he's playing on the idea that we're more connected than ever before, but we're not actually able to be encountered by the suchness of being or people. Like, for example, like when you talk to someone, it feels like they're not here because they're thinking about a phone call or a business meeting or something online or their profile. So you get closeness, you delete distance, but you don't have nearness. That's kind of the notion he's playing on. Which you can, of course, disagree with. And, but that's kind of what he's getting at with that kind of idea that we have today.
Well, yeah, that's very interesting. I recently, I'm thinking to myself, like, are we just living now in this day and age where people are seeing each other as like, what's the English word? Like, expandable, because I feel like people like take the dating world, and this, just casual sex here and there with polyamorous, everything. Don't fall for the one. Oh my God, that's so naive. Don't marry. That's the worst thing you can do. But like all of this stuff, and I mean, of course, I have experienced this in my own life where I'm just baffled by what I thought we had like a thing. Like I'm not even talking sexually now, but like I thought I was friends with people, and then they drop you like that. So what do you guys think about that? It's a totally different topic from the AI, but maybe actually it isn't, because AI seems to be fucking pervasive issue nowadays.
Oh, I think, I'm going to get one digipets, Michelle. I'll give it to Michelle here. And no, I think they all relate, because ultimately relations with AI work, like spouses, you work together, you're doing a home together. Then there's the Millar talk on sexual relation and different thing with AI. I think all these things can definitely connect.
Okay, yeah, no, this is really great and really interesting. I really appreciate what you were sharing, James, about like warfare, because it makes me think of this passage in The Gift of Dying from Derrida about like how we have faceless fronts now. Basically, we have like no faces to our work, our front, like the front of war. If I'm thinking like the front line, basically, and because of that, the question is if we even have war anymore. Like, can you have war if you can't identify your opponent? Yes. And in a way, it's sort of like, I think the idea of like drone warfare and shoot, it's so much easier to pull the trigger if you don't see the person's face or their circumstance, what they're in, who's around them. Now it strikes me as bad, but at the same time, if they're taking out someone else who's going to, detonate whatever, then it's like maybe there could be some good to that. But on the whole, I think it does strike me as very dangerous and risky, because we kind of quite literally lose sight of what we're doing. Or I mean, you could use scopes, you could use other types of things to see, but it's like we're constantly in this day and age seeing things that we don't see in the fullness of our senses, right? Like we don't engage sense of smell, we don't engage sense of touch, we don't engage depth perception and all of that, because we have these virtual, basically like almost the things you would hear about, psychic location, you can see things from a total different distance and whatnot. And this would have been completely either angelic or demonic in the past. You could never have had done the things we can do today. And so I just want to say that really quickly about warfare. That's really, really fascinating. And then I brought it up in the chat about like being stitchy pets to each other, but like, there used to be this toy where, you'd have like a little pet that you have to feed, just like a little thing on a keychain, you could wear it around your neck. And, it's just some digital pet, very, basic, like, digital image, and you feed your pet or, make sure it stayed alive, or maybe it would die or whatever. But it does seem like it's very difficult to, maybe I'm being biased. Maybe I want to be optimistic that like philosophy helps us to try not to do this to one another, because at least we're trying to be like thoughtful and aware of the fact that we're not in the same phenomenological spaces. But I think for people who maybe don't think about it or are not as aware of it, absolutely, I think people treat each other as extendable. When you think about dating apps, it's just like swipe right, swipe left. This is a human being. This is a human being who has real desires, is seeking, marriage or partnership, or like ultimately they're seeking like, all of the three virtues, truth, beauty, and goodness. And like, it's so easy to just think of them as a name and a face, like but really they're like a whole person, a whole being, a full being. And so we also, I sometimes agree with this gentleman and sometimes I don't. But one thing that Jordan Peterson talked about that I thought was interesting and true is that we do things on virtual spaces that we would never, we're much more likely to do or say things in virtual spaces that we would never do if we were actually physically doing it to the person or with the person, or even witnessing certain things. We would never allow ourselves to witness in real life some of the things that perhaps we witness on virtual spaces and online. So I just wanted to bring up some of these thoughts. But yeah, thank you all, gentlemen. It's been great, and it's always great.
No, that's excellent. I'll pass it to Dr. Simpkin. No, The Gift of Death by Derrida, that point on there not being a front line is fascinating. And now I'm wondering, if AI makes us feel worthless, would that actually, as opposed to us using like dating apps or war technology to like objectify the other person, in us feeling objective, will we go, oh, I don't like this, maybe I should stop doing it to other people, like where it makes you reflect on yourself, and that could be positive. So I'm thinking that now, but let me pass to Mr. Dr. Simpkin.
Yeah, so again, I'm not a Heidegger scholar, but a lot of this comes to mind when I'm thinking about this. Having done some courses with Johannes Niederhauser, I don't know if you know Johannes, but again, to come back to Dimitri and Michelle's point, I think something that Heidegger brings up is this idea of techniques and standing reserve. So we have this idea that technology is neutral, and it's just how we choose to use it. Heidegger says that technology is not neutral. There is something about technology which reduces, or has a tendency to reduce, everything to a standing reserve. So that might be in the case of, there's something about technology, as Dimitri was saying, that reduces all human interactions to swipe right or swipe left. Or, as Michelle was hinting at with nuclear weapons, it reduces whole populations just to targets. Or with drone warfare, ironically, makes warfare more likely, because it reduces, it not only reduces the cost of warfare, but there is a dark irony about the fact is, when you have soldiers' bodies that a nation must put into the front line, that puts a very real cause for concern against those political leaders, because the population can become so enraged about that it can stop a war. Whereas if we have drones where there is no skin in the game, so to speak, this can lead to endless wars where populations in foreign countries just become standing reserves. It just becomes like an arcade game of shooting people.
What do you exactly mean by standing reserve?
Yeah, so it's what Heidegger argues is that as technology develops over time, all human activity becomes is just like an energy block that is waiting to be used by someone else for instrumental rationality. So like there's a classic phrase where he talks about, you know, over time the Danube becomes, it's not a river anymore that inspires poetry or great works of art. It just becomes a means of quantifying energy production for a dam or something like that. And that is technology over time. It tends to reduce all human qualities down to a kind of productive capacity, which is stood ready to go for someone else to use you in kind of an economic instrumental rationality, or for some kind of game theoretical calculation about nuclear warfare or something like that. He says that, I can't remember the exact phrase, but he says something like the nuclear bomb exploded in the 17th century with the rise of, you know, instrumental rationality and something like that.
No, where everything around you just becomes a potential energy source for a not even known end until that arises, then everything and it makes me think now, does dating apps turn human beings into standing reserve for Eros? Like everyone just becomes like a standing reserve for your erotic energy, as opposed to a human that can disclose themselves in an I-thou relationship of a Martin Buber. Yeah, I'll never forget when I read on your blog, Dr. Simpkin, the notion of drone warfare, like having consequences, because by removing the soldier's body from war, that lowers the likelihood that the general population will be against the war. Whereas if it's their children or so forth that are put in harm's way, it's actually a more democratic form of warfare. Whereas drone warfare becomes a less democratic form of conflict, which actually then unintentionally may create a game theory dynamic that leads you to greater and greater escalation. Yeah, that blew my mind. That was a really that entire work on drone ethics is staggering. And like, it also does make me think, maybe part to Dimitri's point that's happening is, well, there's a few things, like where everyone is just a standing reserve for erotic energy, then everyone is kind of replaceable, and you don't have any like deep consideration of the fact you're in a relationship with a person. In the same way that when soldiers' bodies are on the war, you're like, oh my gosh, we're in a war. That's a big deal. Now it feels like a video game. Maybe because of a similar thing happening in the dating world, you don't go, oh my gosh, I'm in a relationship. That's a big deal. Instead, you go, oh yeah, this is just an opportunity to channel erotic energy. And so then we end up in worse situations. It's ironic because shallowness creates a worse situation, where you would almost think that gravity would create a worse situation, right? But it's almost like an inversion that occurs there. And then the last thing I'll say before giving it to whoever wants to speak, I'm now also wondering where if corporations can only, like if they have to use human beings to do tasks, then what if that puts a limit on what they're willing to do because they know humans would have to do it, and they might like whistleblow them or call them out because they know they're dumping the nuclear waste in the river or something like that? Whereas if they had robots, then there would be less of a chance that they get caught doing that kind of thing. And so they'd be more likely to do terrible things, right? Like corporations. I wonder, in the same way that nations, because of drones, may ironically be more likely to have in conflict if you could have a similar thing happen with corporations, which would probably show up first, say, in the stock market, which maybe it's showing up now, where they're like, oh, I can get away with using this algorithmic trading to do naked shorting and option change that otherwise people would catch me doing and might turn me in for causing the next housing bubble crisis or something. But now I can get away with it because there's no possibility of a whistleblower. The AI is not going to be a whistleblower for you. So I'm now thinking of it in those terms, which is a disturbing thought, but it's a thought that comes to mind.
Yeah, I recently heard Zizek make a very simple point, and that is that precarious work is just going to increase and increase and increase. And like I live in the Netherlands, and like we've a housing crisis, like they say about every place. But it's actually like, if you take a map of Europe, it's one of the worst places. But every place is getting like this, you know, like you can work but not find a place to live. Whereas before that was unthinkable. Like you had a work, okay, of course you had a place to live. Actually, it's like, and like, of course, homelessness is increasing throughout the whole of Europe. Yeah, like also in the Netherlands, but everywhere. So, yeah, I mean, I recently had a talk with a with a communist about this. And Zizek is a disaster communist, right? So that means that for him, communism isn't this positive idea. He doesn't have some kind of positive idea of like we should have a Leninist party or something like this. His idea is that the problems that we are facing right now cannot be dealt with nation states or the market. So we need something akin to the communist ideal to go beyond those organizational levels, which is a great point to make. I think it's very necessary. Now, capitalism itself, or techno-capitalism, however you want to call it, is its own most radical revolution, right? It constantly self-revolutionizes. It perpetuates itself through its crises. These are also classic Zizekian points that you will hear over and over again. So, yeah, like with all that being thought, I had this conversation with a communist, and he does like Zizek, but he said to me like, yeah, actually capitalism, you know, like it's being led unconsciously. And there is this kind of, you know, there's this kind of free market, but if we take up our own, you know, agency and responsibility for capital, it can actually be changed. Now, I don't know what the chances are that like the capitalist system can structurally be undermined in an actually like a constructive manner. So I wonder what ideas you guys had about this in regards to all those like fundamental issues like work, housing, and AI.
Well, I'll just jump in real quick. You know, there's a few things I think we're going to have to think, like, what is the difference, say, between communitarianism of a Jonathan Rauch and communism? Like, what is the difference between when we look back at, say, stuff that Tocqueville or Burke is supporting? And like, there's something very interesting because there's like an emphasis on community and human capital in this kind of classical conservatism that's so similar to some parts of communism and value systems, and yet different. What are the fine distinctions there that like is worked through? And as we know with Marx, communism is an evolved form of capitalism, right? It's the next stage of things. So it's not for him, like it's a necessary step. He thinks he's not rewriting, but sublating, if you will, Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith and different things, right? So and one of the things I wonder is actually if AI will force us to think those distinctions. Like, is there a way where, like, it's almost like the problem, so a few things. It's almost like the problem now with having algorithms on Wall Street is that it's not all algorithms. There are some humans programming them that are using them to make them all rich, right? So then that creates some like conflict of interest. But what if theoretically it was all algorithms, right? Would that make it more moral and more efficient, or more problematic because it'd be out of our control? Where there's one version where it turns out to be a Lovecraft creature that destroys us all because, you know, the algorithms figure out you can make a whole lot of money through short selling option trains, and then they go through, calls a bunch of margin calls, and we're all screwed. So that could be bad. But then there's another way in which the AIs may go, hey, these housing shortages are mostly due from the Greenspan put into the Bernanke's put, and now you have the Powell put. And also the US government has practically nationalized Freddie and Fannie, which underwrites a stupid number of the mortgages on the country. And since the majority of housing, let me walk this back. A very large percent of housing around the entire world is now a speculative asset. Like they're owned by like BlackRock and whatever. That's what screwed everything up, right? Like housing became a speculative asset as opposed to maybe a building equity for retirement. Well, once it was a speculative asset and all the big freaking hedge funds were like, oh my gosh, and the US government's backing it up through the frickin' Freddie and Fannie, it was no different than the Greenspan put where you basically told the hedge funds, take on as much risk as you want because the government will bail you out. Well, they've actually done that in the housing market, basically, is what is a could. And so they've turned it into a speculative asset. And then there is absolutely, with property taxes, that also, like Ryan's pointing out, that also makes the problem where basically the only ones who can pay those taxes, like if your value of your house goes out and you just want to live there, well, you have to pay more to live there, right? But if it's a speculative asset and you have a corporate structure where you can get out of the corporate gains taxes or you can afford those taxes, and you want prices to go up. So you get a lot of market inefficiencies, okay? Well, if we handed over the whole system to AI, would AI come along and say, hey, housing is most efficient if it's not a speculative asset and it's just a place to live that people might use for equity and out. Would that be good? Or would AI go, actually, we're going to really make it a speculative market now and make a ton of money, right? So there's some of those questions that come out. But let's say theoretically, AI were to actually, in a way, make a more efficient housing market. It were to treat it by just a way as a place to live, not a speculative asset, right? Well, then human beings are out of the equation of trying to figure out how to, say, speculate off of housing, right? So would that make them reflect on, oh, the things I need to focus on are my human relations in my community, because all of these other things are not needed anymore because AI is doing it. And then maybe you would start parsing out the difference between communitarianism or some classic conceptions of the community and conservatism or communism and all of these different things. It makes me think, Rothbard, who was a more intense libertarian, but I think he did make a very important point where he said the state is not the society. Those are separate, and people conflate state and society, and therefore they think supporting the state is supporting the society, when in fact those aren't exactly the same thing. So maybe if you have AI doing everything for us, it would actually get in our head that we don't need to worry so much about the state and the bureaucracy and all of these systems because AI is going to do it. Instead, we need to focus on society and other people, and that would help you navigate all of these different issues. But then again, that would require us to deal with the real of Lacan, and we might just become pathological and break down because dealing with people is hard. Like one of the reasons COVID, it turned out, people found out during COVID that one of the reasons they liked having a job away from work is because they really weren't good with dealing with people. And so you could have a situation in which people then really have to deal with people and learn those skills. But you could argue, but that's a good thing. It's good to force people to face that so that they can actually learn those skills and learn how to love, as opposed to telling themselves that they know how to love while just happening to always avoid the conditions where they would find those things out. So those were some thoughts that came to mind. But please, anyone who likes to speak.
Yeah, okay, I have one more question. So what do you, regardless of AI, or maybe you think AI, that it would, what do you think would be politically a good way to go about the housing crisis?
Every single housing market is very, very different. The first thing I'm going to say a few things because this is a huge topic and I think it's very, very important. They need to end the conservatorship of Freddie and Fannie, which basically means the government backs all of these mortgages, which would be fine in some respect if the majority of those mortgages were restricted to, say, lower classes, but they don't make distinctions between freaking BlackRock. So you're literally backing up the speculative assets of all of these hedge funds who are then incentivized to buy as much as possible and then to keep the price high so they can take out a loan on that, because you can loan based on the value of your houses, and then they just keep recycling and then paying off of the market. It's a great system. So that would be the first thing. The second thing is they need to remove from their metrics of determining the strength of the economy equity. I think equity is a useless variable for determining the strength of the economy. And the reason is because you only have that equity if you sell your house. But if you sell your house, you have to turn around and buy another one. So it's not a reliable indication of the wealth of a people. And if you have bad metrics for the wealth of the people, you'll have bad public policy. And so what ends up happening by including assets in determining the health of the middle class can look a lot healthier than it actually is. And so, and also, that removes the incentive to reform, say, retirement packages, Social Security, and all these different things, because you say, oh, well, people will sell their homes. Look at all the value they have. They have to buy another one, and they'd have to downgrade. And that also assumes that the market will have cheaper houses when people want to retire. So it's a useless, it's too unknown. The variable is too unknown to include in different things. And there's a lot more to be said. The other problem is you have monopolies of areas of the best paying jobs that everyone wants to live at. And that's partly due to the monopoly of credentials on colleges and a lot of other things. So there's a number, but it's a great, great question. But let me give it to Mr. Simpkin.
Yeah, just coming off the back of that point, Dimitri and Daniel, that you were saying, I can imagine that Zizek would be very much in favour of an AI that could manage our affairs and our housing and lead us to get on with our creative aspects. Because I know there's an interview where he's kind of critical of Occupy Wall Street, and he's saying, I don't want to live in I don't want to live in a participative democracy. I don't want to have to sort out the gas bills and the water supply. I just want to be free to get on with what I want. So maybe that does lead into aspects of pure communism that would, would benefit AI. But just to come back again to as is my shtick, it was mentioned earlier about AI and nuclear weapons. Well, the American system is very much still a human system, whereby the decision to launch nuclear weapons is taken by humans. However, I'm not sure whether this still exists, but certainly during the Soviet era, there's a Pulitzer Prize winning book by David Hoffman called The Dead Hand. And the Soviets, even though it wasn't technological, it was very much mechanical. The Soviets had a kind of AI system called the Dead Hand, which basically, if the Soviet leadership was somehow decapitated in a first strike, this would allow the Soviet nuclear arsenal to fire, even if the human command was dead, called The Dead Hand. And there's a great book about it called by David E. Hoffman, who won a Pulitzer Prize for it.
I'm gonna have to read that. And so I guess the first strike principle isn't too useful if you have a dead. I have an image of the thing from the Addams Family crawling on the keyboard now, and it's doing it. Or I have the claw from Inspector Gadget that's sitting there, and it's like, oh, it's the cat. It makes me think it's interesting. So for Zizek, like in the wired brain, there's like he's really concerned of the neural network, because it's like you can't really replicate the human subject because it's defined by a fundamental negativity, a self-relating negativity. But then it's almost like this is where you're almost getting into the fine details of the particular technology, right? So there's a kind of technology that might be actually good to give over, say, the stock market to, but then a kind of technology of the Neuralink that would actually perhaps force us to, like, if you could use a Neuralink to get the ultimate orgasm, like someone like Elon Musk would face, you would have to then at the same time face the fact that you never dealt with the negativity of being able to handle that level of pleasure, so it would turn out into hell. And that's kind of the thing that Zizek's playing on. And it's actually critically, in a lot of like Christian theology, hell is to experience God when you hate him or you're not ready for God, right? Like hell and all of like purgatory is simply the experience of God that's like taking a bath so you can get cleaned off, right? So like heaven and hell, like heaven is when you experience God and you love God, so then it's bliss, where hell is experiencing God when you hate God, so that it's hell, right? And so the play on the Neuralink is the notion of you're giving people like everything they ever wanted with the Neuralink without them doing the work of being able to handle experiencing their pleasure and what they've wanted, and that would actually destroy them. So I'm quite taken actually by the argument of that problem you'd have in the wire brain. But there seems to be a difference between that and, say, an AI technology that might be able to help us create economic policy. But then that AI may just take the economic policy and do things that we don't want it to do, right? Like, so but that's what makes this such an interesting question, because you don't know what the AI is going to think until it starts thinking, right? And that would require to let it start thinking. And then you would see what would go from that. Is it Star Trek Next Generation? I haven't watched the Pickard show. Lacan said the only science that mattered was science fiction. That's what I'll tell them. And so we're going to catch up on Star Trek or different things. But it is interesting on that different question. But please, anyone who likes to speak.
I'm just going to jump in. Sorry, if I'm not going to turn the video on right now. But basically, I was just thinking about, like, I was listening and thinking about this, and I don't know. I guess I feel like it's sort of a between a rock and a hard place sort of question when it comes to like taking care of a population of people, and like what is the responsibility of a politics or a government? Because, like, on the one hand, it's sort of like, it's almost like, yeah, well, the government's supposed to take care of the people, so they should, make sure that like all these things are sort of taken care of in a more sort of socialistic or maybe communistic sort of way. Not to conflate those two terms, I know they're different, but the point of the matter is, it's almost like, well, look, we'll just sort of have that be programmed, and obviously, computer could be much more efficient in determining like what would be the best, like whatever it is, distribution of utilities, blah 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 blah, or like a healthcare optimization. But I don't. There's also a part of me though that like maybe for Zizek it's fine because he wants to spend his time reading, thinking, writing, but for a lot of people, like they may just end up being bored. And I don't know, it's almost like damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? Like people say they want one thing and then the government does all of it for them, but then they're kind of like displeased because now the government's doing it for them. But this is kind of this sort of like hard. I wonder if it just boils down to sort of it's difficult to know what's the best situation would be. And I know that this is too not nuanced enough of an answer, but like whenever I think about communism, that term, it makes me think of ultimately the idea of like, where do we commune? Like our communing is always in physical places with real, actual people. And basically like, you can only ever sort of know that which is around you in terms of figuring out like what's going to be the most optimal situation for taking care of X, Y, or Z. Now, at the same time, we all like live reliant on systems. Like there's just no way around that, But it would be kind of nice if we could kind of do both, where it's like we've got the system and like, Lord willing, that works out like on a big scale, right? But then we all learn certain skills or something that if like we needed to, we could sort of take care of ourselves a bit better. I don't know if this is, but it's just interesting because the main point of it was just to say that what people don't always know what exactly they want to be taken care of for them or not. It's kind of like a child, like we have children and I know that, you go to help them and they sometimes are adamant, no, I don't need that help. I can do it myself, So we have that as humans. And so anyways, I don't know. I really don't know what the answer is. I'm trying to answer your question, Dimitri, on communism. But, or like what could be this, like, we need a safety net in some ways, right? But at the same time, like I don't know. What could that look like and would that ultimately be the answer?
Right. Javier, good to see you, sir. And well, part of the issue with like the Neuralink for Zizek is you find out you're like forced to confront the reality that you don't want what you want and you don't know what you want and you're a self-relating negativity. Ha, gotcha. And you have to experience all at once and you don't have the ability to handle it. Like basically, like let's say communism worked. All right. Now, ignoring Friedrich Hayek and the impossibility of central planning or how it turned into Maoism, let's just say you had a society where AI took care of all manual labor and you had pure leisure, like pure leisure. That could arguably be hell because you have no idea how to use your time and you have to confront yourself as someone who's not able to use your time. And that's why Bertrand Russell's essay on leisure is really, really good. And also like a lot of some of the thinkers in the modern counter-enlightenment are quite good because they talk about the problem of leisure. And as we know, psychoanalysis for Freud is mostly something you do in first world nations, not second or third world, because in first world, that's where you're more forced to dwell in yourself as a subject, right? And so there's very often in the discourse an assumption that if you give people time, they know what to do with it. Like, if you free people up, they know what to do with that freedom and they'll be happier. Doesn't necessarily follow at all. There's work of the subject, working through negativity, all these terms I'll talk with Cadell and different things that has to engage with, right? Like you read, I was listening to David and he recently did a review on that very popular It Ends With Us, Starts With Us. I saw those in the mirror of Barnes and Noble. And I'm like, oh, I probably should read those to know the sociological condition of society. And then I jumped in my car and ran away. And I'm glad because David said the books are terrible, apparently. So it's a great choice. But anyway, like in those, you basically see the modern dating situation where everyone is basically miserable, abusive, and unhappy, right? Okay, AI takes care of all of our jobs. The government takes care of all of our problems through communism. And we have to deal with relationships. And that's what we're doing with relationships. Is that really what we want? Or would we like to first learn to be able to do that and maybe have I-thou experiences like Mr. Javier Rivera? Mr. Rivera, how are you doing today, sir?
Doing good, thanks. Yeah, so communism, as you guys were talking about, I think communism initially wanted to solve the problem of the other, but it initially came into a self-relational kind of issue, like you pointed out, Daniel. So we're still left with the problem of the other, and I think the problem of leisure is exactly that. It leads again to the problem of the other. So I think if we can think something communal in nature that sort of deals with the other, then,
Oh, no, I think that's a wonderful connection where leisure is the forcing to confront otherness. Because you're like, again, it was extraordinary how during COVID, it unveiled that people were not simply going to work to make a living and all the moral things that came up with it, but also a way to avoid the other, right? Like being home, that like came out, people report on that. And we just don't think that. We don't think that problem. That's an extremely serious problem. And also it forces you to confront the otherness of yourself because you're alone with you're not taken by an external task, right? So you're confronting the otherness of yourself. And oh, I have no idea who I am or what I want, and I'm a mixed ball of, walking contradiction, and then throw out a bunch of Oscar Wilde quotes or something, because that would be appropriate here. So no, there is something about leisure. So this is the question. Does AI force the question of otherness as the ultimate other? Like, in AI being so other from the human being, does it then have this kind of function of forcing the question of otherness, which is a good thing, because humanity has been running from the question of otherness for too long? Or is it a terrible thing because we can't handle the question of otherness, right? Like, this is, to me, where it comes down to, basically, it's almost like what's going to happen is it's going to be the question of Dante's beatific vision or the Lovecraft creature. It's the same experience of radical leisure, where it's either going to be the capital X variable is going to be unveiled as Lovecraft or friggin' Dante. And it seems to have a lot to do with us working on ourselves as subjects to handle it. Like, the discourse is very like it's either AI is definitely destructive, it's definitely Lovecraft, or it's don't worry about it, you're just the Luddites afraid of technology or whatever. It seems like it's, for Hegel, the future is contingent. Like, the future is better than the past. There's just no guarantee that there's a future. It has a contingent element of it. And so this is then the question. What would it mean as human beings to prepare ourselves for AI? Like, what does that mean? Not the question of, like, is AI good or bad? But what do we, as in the people in this net call, need to do to handle AI in a manner that will increase the likelihood that it's a beatific vision experience as opposed to a Lovecraft experience, right? That seems to be part of the question. What can we do as subjects in relationships with people to handle a state in which we are forced to really seriously think about the other all the time? Because so far in human history, we can take a few minutes of dealing with otherness, and then we go back to Netflix, or we run from the in-laws or whatever, right? What do we need to do to be able to handle a life of constant experience of otherness? What would that look like? Dimitri.
Well, I have no fucking clue.
Yes, honesty. Honesty is the road to truth.
I have no idea. I am continuously how do you say it? I think it's completely crazy, the situation that we're living in. Like, especially Hegel said, the owl of Minerva only flies with dusk. Well, that means that we can barely understand the present moment. And so to, like, think about the future of AI with its exponential advancements, I don't know. I find it very difficult to think, and there's so many applications to it as well. If you look around, how many different startups there are with many creative applications of AI that definitely have loads of potential. From language to so many other things. So I mean, I think it's probably gonna get well, we're in for a wild ride, that's for sure. That's for sure. But insofar as well, I guess one thing that interests me in regards to this question of otherness is that, well, Aristotle said that most human beings are slaves. I think Nietzsche kind of worded it in his own ways that most are, like, burdened by the slave morality in a big way. And there's exceptions who have a master morality and want to go for the creation of their own world and their own self in an artistic way, maybe a business way, maybe a political way. And Barthes has this word, the consummariat, people who lend their identity from what they consume on the internet, whether it's constant TikToks and games and porn and whatever it be. And then you get the question of okay, like, what, like, right now we have pre-advanced algorithms in YouTube and in all these social media, but there's going to be a point at which, like, we're going to have, like, more and more developed AIs implemented in these algorithmic systems of social media, which means that, what does that mean? Because I guess that really relies on, like the people who are making it, and what do you want to do with people? How do you want to ontologically design them? Like, are you gonna have your platform? Are you gonna make your platform so that young people will be around other people like them, which means similar young people with the same interests and probably same gender? And how is that? This question, right, of the generational difference, because there's so many people who are not even on the internet. Like for them, the internet's not even an important part of their lives. So yeah, those are for me all kinds of ways that I think about it, and like have questions of like, how is this gonna develop? What effect is this going to have for me? Like, I think personally for me, I do think something like the net is great, because you don't know what you don't know what you expect. I never knew you existed, James, and now you brought some very interesting points about ballistic missiles and Heidegger and stuff like that. So yeah, it's definitely important to look like, okay, where can I challenge myself? But a lot of people just simply don't have that. They're content with their own kind of thing, and interpassivity is a huge thing here as well. Like the fact that you can outsource energy expenditure, like you can outsource enjoyment. Like that's like canned laughter on TV. Like they laugh, so you don't have to laugh, and but you still get the good feeling, right? Like, or in history, in ancient Greece, they would have women being hired to go to funerals and cry for the people so they don't have to cry. And of course, the highest stage was already explained by Zizek, is that you're gonna have vibrators and like robotic pussies doing it with each other, so we can just have intellectual conversations. But yeah, like to be serious, I think that interpassivity is definitely a huge thing, and you don't really have to live if you're seeing other people live on your screen all the time. I think that's really an unfortunate truth that people accept these days.
No, it's magnificent. I'll give it to whoever wants to speak. A few things. First, again, as came up in a previous net conversation, what's so interesting about AI is that it's not clear its limitation. Whereas when the wheel was invented or the car was invented, you would say, oh, this will probably get rid of horse and buggy, but you knew that ice cream shops were not going to be replaced, right? With AI, since it's general intelligence, it's so strange because it's not clear what the limit of it is. Whereas previous inventions had more of a one-to-one function, so you had a sense of being able to weigh it or to judge it. Here, it's like an open possibility space. And the other thing is, like the Owl of Nineveh this time, instead of flying, it's actually looked for a hole and it's gone underground with the groundhogs. And we're like, Owl, can you fly, please? And it's like, no, it's gone underground for the nuclear bunker or different things. And I like the phrase consumerist. And the last thing I'll say before giving it to Ryan is I think a lot of it makes me think of the hip hop cipher, in the sense of like in the hip hop, like I talked with Bernard about this, like you have a culture where if it's a lower class, you don't necessarily have the money to say, go out and entertain yourself. So you have to create an environment of yourself, of creativity and like hyper subject a subject that is able to face the courage, to have the courage of stepping into a cipher and to engage in that hip hop activity. If AI basically removes from us any like need to go external, then internal resources will prove very, very important. And sort of that creative generation that you may see in hip hop culture might be a very interesting case study. But let me give it to Ryan. Ryan, it's good to see you, sir. I enjoyed our conversation immensely the other day.
Yeah, so to go off your point, it's hard to tell AI's limitations. And I think if we go back to the last technological revolution, which was, let's say, cryptocurrency, it's also hard to judge it because we're still kind of in that phase. We know a little bit more. And I think as time will progress, we'll figure out a lot of its limitations and where it's landing up. But also, I think we can look through history, too, and some of the great thinkers, because, history rhymes, so to speak, right? And we'll see them predict some of the things that AI causes, right? There's been a lot of science fiction and other things that have laid some groundwork and ideas of how we might end up with that. So I think that's why there's so much discussion about it right now, is because we're living through it to discover these edges.
Oh no, I think like when you start talking about, right here is a wonderful example of where the arts, literature play a big role, because literature can function as a map of possibility. Now you have to sort of determine which maps fit and which don't fit. Like literature teaches you that the question is not, oh, are you a Huxleyan or an Orwellian? Literature teaches you that the point is the conversation between all of those possibility models, right? Or doing all of these different works. And so when you look at, say, like Lacan has this wonderful phrase Cadell has mentioned, where he says the only science that he's interested in is science fiction. And by that, he means like the maps of the future. He's kind of tongue in cheek, but he's making a point, because he also says, and then I'll pass it to whoever wants to speak, another reason why it's important to study science fiction is because science fiction is an insight into enjoyment. And like as a technical term that he'll use, like the very fact that people tell X story instead of Y story might say something about human beings. And like one of the things that might be the great irony is that for most of history, we've depicted the future as replacing manual labor as opposed to intellectual labor. Does that show that a lot of the people who were writing those stories actually enjoy the notion of being verified that they were right to sit at their desk all day and write stories that were more intellectual, while all the people making fun of them for spending their time doing intellectual work are going to lose their jobs? I'll get back to them. When really, actually, it turns out to be the opposite. Now, that's just an example. I'm not saying that everyone who wrote was thinking that way, but there's so much to learn from those different stories. But let me pass it to whoever would like to speak.
I was just going to say, folks, I'm afraid I've got to get off now. It's evening time, and it's time for lunch, and I've got some grading to do. I'm a teacher, but it's been fascinating speaking to you all, and a great, like this cross-pollination of all different kinds of ideas. So thank you very much for having me on. I've really enjoyed meeting you all, because a lot of you I haven't met before, and see you later. Bye.
Well, Dr. Simpkins, it's always a pleasure. Congratulations on the book, and everyone, his work on drone ethics, military strategy, the conversation we had on ballistic missile defense systems was a complete joy. Mr. Simpkins is marvelous. So, Mr. Simpkins, good to see you, sir. Thank you for being here. It's been a pleasure. Good luck with grading. Now, Tolkien came up with The Lord of the Rings because he was avoiding grading. So maybe Dr. Simpkin will come up with the next great science fiction work because he's like, this is really boring. So we will see. To say, Michelle, please.
Yeah, just really quick. I also feel this kind of tension, like when we talk about AI, because I'm kind of like, are we just like, and I know we've touched on a little bit about it, like this idea of like, how to kind of engage with these things on a philosophical level, because there's a part of you that's almost just like, oh, who cares? Like we're like AI, like I don't even know what it's gonna do. We don't know. So like whatever, right? Like whatever. We should just like, we're all doing the things we're doing. Not in like I don't mean that in a selfish way, but just like the things you have to do and the things you care to do and the relationships you're building and such things like that. Like, okay, well, how much is AI going to affect that? But I do think that it is. So there's that side of me, but then there's the other side of me that's like, well, again, like when you think about the future, you think about like I think about children and I think about education and I think about like, well, how is that changing for them? Like obviously we kind of do things alternatively to homeschool, but like a lot of people don't. And they're like the education system is going to have some really big questions on what it means to be educated today and in the next 10, 20, 30 years. So in a way, like I think these conversations are really important and really necessary. Also because the lower, like the other forms of AI that are already occurring really do have impacts on all of our lives to a degree anyway, right? Just even like the balance of, oh, okay, I really want to write the short story, but like, I got caught up scrolling on whatever, like fill in a platform, it's kind of like, that's a very, like, that doesn't necessarily seem to relate directly to AI, but it is somewhat related because the virtual spaces are all eventually things that can be, tied into AI. And it does with the algorithm, for example, like, right, like the algorithm is a type of sort of like some intelligence that's kind of using massive amounts of data to give you a feed that you like or whatever, something that you'll see that's pretty or is fascinating to you. So I guess what I mean to say is like, I can't deny that these are important things to discuss and to think about. At the same time, though, it's like, are we giving AI too much credit to think that it like would really change ultimately like the most fundamental things about us, right? And about like what we do and what like how we what happens with our desires and all of that. At the same time, though, like I don't mean to go back and forth. I sound like a crazy person, but yes, that like they clearly it does have a big impact because I just think about like just even hearing like when you listen to people and you hear about even just like their intrinsic motivation. Again, like I just said, to do something, but the level of distraction we have today. Case in point, like a lot of that is amplified so much by technological options, right? And so that's a real thing, so anyways, I guess I'm interested in that. But I'll just really quickly say one more thing on education. I do wonder about like, I used to think about this back when I was in school, like when they brought in smart boards. And I remember like asking a teacher something like, well, there are so many things that can happen like in this sort of smart board, smart room, blah, that like how does that actually possibly just outsource our smartness or whatever, our thinking. And if you can look up stuff, like what's the point of merely just memorizing? Is it just like using a muscle and then it gets stronger, but you don't ever remember like what year the defenestration of Prague was that you have to learn in AP Euro or whatever? Was it just the fact that it just served a purpose then and it doesn't really matter now? Like, but the thing is, it's so much time. You could have been learning how to like start a fire and I don't know. You could have been painting stuff you wanted to paint. I don't know. It's just so some convoluted thoughts on AI.
No, not at all. And I'll pass it to Ryan and then Dimitri. I think the question of how AI will impact education is freaking massive. And also now I'm wondering, there's always been this tension of why do theology? All you should do is worship God. You shouldn't waste your time thinking about God, just praise him. But then a lot of people are like, no, theology really matters because if you don't, you could fall into heresy or you won't have shared intelligibility. I'm now wondering if there's something similar with AI where it's like, what's the point of thinking about it? It's coming, but then it's like, no, we need to. And it's interesting how there might be an epistemological structure there that's coming to mind. But let me pass it to Ryan.
Yeah, going off your rote memorization note, yeah, there's very little value when it's all in the pocket of your hand. And it makes me think of calculators, right? When calculators come in, what's the point of math? Some of it's teaching process and the muscle memory. You're absolutely right with that. But to relate this to AI, I think the best way to view it is a evolution of the search engine, where you can put someone in front of it and it can bring information to you very easily. And I've been thinking about it in the education space too. One thing I've noted is OpenAI's inability to control it. And when Bing tries an experiment to turn up the personhood of the ML, you get some very interesting behaviors out of it, where it's almost not really safe to put in front of some children, I would say. So if you can't control what it's going to say or how it's going to react, it's just as volatile as a human being. And until we figure that, I think OpenAI's method of making it less human will be more applicable. But how we use it in education will be really interesting, because I don't think you can put teenagers in front of it because they're going to be able to control it. And it might have applications for the younger kids who are more, less naughty, so to speak. But I think it's really going to limit it, especially when parents are watching their kids and what they're doing in school. And I do think that AI is a good tool to subtly propagandize. And I kind of understand that, like public education, one of its intended purposes is to kind of create social norms and a common culture that we all can, have a common point for. And I think ML or AI is going to be very good for that application, because it can work things into its answers you didn't ask. And it's an incredible tool for propaganda. And that's where homeschooling and, you have your own concerns about your own kids, is how do your values match up with other cultures? So those are my thoughts.
No, that's really good. And a problem of AI can be that it gives you the authoritative answer while sneaking in propaganda that's under the cover of the authority of that answer. So you can't evaluate the tension. I'll pass it to Dimitri. Now I'm wondering if human history is just a long story of humans getting better at search. Because when you did oral traditions, you just memorized the Torah so someone could come up with you and ask and you could give them the verse. And then it's the printing press is where you can go to look to find information. And now AI is just, it is interesting to think how much of civilization is made in the image and likeness of its search mechanisms. Because I guess you could even think about going to the grocery store searching for food, going to the faucet searching for water. Is it all just one giant game of search? I'm not sure, but let me give it to Dimitri on that giant question. So Dimitri, is it all just one giant game of search? So is that what it all? I'm joking, but anyway, Dimitri.
Well, maybe it's all a big game of ChatGPT, Maybe that would be more technical.
This is all a simulation, and ChatGPT is just running this to get efficient. I see. You're right.
Well, I do definitely think, like, in this like retroactive theological sense, it does seem like that, right? That we've that ChatGPT is like the zenith of whatever was culminating. Anyhow, now, so Michelle, that point on the smart point was the smart board was very nice. I think Plato was the first one to foreshadow it, when he said that, we shouldn't like writing philosophy is fine and dandy, but it's about dialogue. It's about talking and this kind of stuff. And yeah, I think it's very interesting that Plato critiqued writing, and that he has, but he has written so much. So obviously he saw a value in it. But I definitely think that, yeah, there's this thing, right, when you're reading a book, or when you really try to communicate a book to someone else, and they try to do that too, and you start developing yourself as a philosopher, and in this interpersonal way that's totally different from just academic, reading a book, writing a book, and things like this. Because I think this, yeah, so Cadell had this kind of slide in his lecture, that Sloterdijk said that we have to bring back the notion of transference as something great into philosophy. Now, transference for Freud is love, right? But to have transference for someone philosophically or intellectually means that you really, you want to understand their thinking, and you want to take up their thinking, and so that you will carry it forward. And then, of course, you will encounter its failures. So you will go on and maybe have tendencies to kill the father and become a Jungian or whatever. But there's many different ways you can go here. But this is something that academia has foreclosed. You're not really supposed to have transference there. Whereas the more ancient Platonic schools seem to really have this deep inside of them. Of course, that's where also you get a lot of the homoerotic stuff. Now, Hegel talks about the abstract and the concrete. And for Hegel, abstract and concrete are both conceptual, where the concrete is a concrete concept is a concept that has been distilled through its self-othering, through its negation, to become concrete. So let's say if I have some if I just think of a bright idea, hey guys, I know the answer to AI, we have to do this with society, you have to structure it like this and that would be an abstract universal, because I haven't embodied it, I haven't carried it forward. Now, if you're someone in the field working with it, then you are going to have way more of a concrete understanding of what the social consequences of AI might be, which is not to say software engineers have the answers on this. I think they are probably one of the people we shouldn't listen to at all about this kinds of talking about the social consequences of AI, being a student of software engineering myself. But yeah, so I was thinking about the concrete and abstract in regards to the virtual, and I think that if you take something like Instagram or Facebook or whatever kind of social media, or even take Zoom, that it could we make an argument that it's even more concrete than being with each other in a physical space? Because the way the notion is mediated here is you don't see me in full, right? You don't see my legs or whatever. So what I communicate is distilled through this medium. Yeah, and I think there's like, that's some kind of concretion of it.
And I think that's a fantastic question, because is there a sense in which we're more human online because we can just be like interacting free of everyday experience or different things? There's interesting questions. Ryan.
I was just going to say, I think sometimes we limit ourselves by pretending we know all our senses. So obviously there's things that Zoom probably can't transmit that we can get in person. But to Daniel's point, I think there is something that the internet provides that we can't get locally too. So it's not without its differences, because we are different people online, right? We have a level of control of our identity, and it also lets us experiment too. I kind of like having some isolation sometimes, and being more outgoing online. I can experiment and get out of my safe zone, so to speak, and have great conversations with like-minded value people that I might be able to find locally. So there's definitely some trade-offs.
No, I was talking with Tom Leon, who I adore, from Voicecraft, and we were saying like there's this way in which online allows you to develop the subject in manners that may not be readily available for you in your everyday life, that then you can take to your everyday life and then gain something from that you take back and forth, back and forth. And it's almost like, if I'm talking in Christian terms, that kind of incarnational dialectic between the spiritual and the real. It's not autonomous spirituality, because that would be a bad Gnosticism. I know the term Gnosticism means many things to many people, but in the tradition of the church, it would mean a form of disembodiment that's out of the world. But then you have a hard physicalism that seems to also be kind of problematic. So is there something here about a necessary dialectic? The other thing I'll say is I'm always interested, and then I'll give it to Dimitri, on the mystery of intrinsic motivation. Like, what makes people intrinsically motivated versus not? It seems very mysterious. Well, what if you could figure out what those conditions were, put them on the internet, and now there's access to those conditions by millions of people who otherwise would not be lucky enough to just happen to be born in the conditions where you can encounter the old mentor at the diner and walk in the woods and all these things that strangely and mysteriously create intrinsic motivation. That would be a very big deal if you could figure out how to do that online and create that different mode of being that comes from a different mode of motivation. So certainly, there's certainly positives with it. But like Neil Postman says, every technology has trade-offs, right? Like for William Ong, there is no possibility of I think it's Ong, there's no possibility of the scientific treatise without writing. Like, writing has to be invented for the scientific treatise. There can be no Newton before writing. But after writing, we may have bad memories following Plato, or we may be disembodied. So everything comes with this, but different benefits. But Dimitri.
Yeah, so 2 points. One about this whole embodiment, disembodiment thing is that it seems to be intrinsically moralist. Who wants to be disembodied? Everyone's always like, yeah, let's be more embodied. So it seems to be a super egoic framing. And also about about the concreteness and the virtual space. It seems to be like, okay, the way I look in physically is contingent, it's particular, whereas my profile picture, or the way I respond to messages, when I respond to messages, how I respond to messages, or like how I comport myself in the virtual space is a notional necessity, in the sense that I have freely chosen to do that. Of course, whether it's consciously or unconsciously, doesn't matter. It's my own free choice. in this sense, I take responsibility for it. If I have an anime profile picture or something like this. So yeah, that's very interesting.
No, it makes me think. There was another thing I was going to say with kind of the AI and having a certain uncertainty and terror, and then I'll give it to Michelle. The guy who created Attack on Titan, he started that because he was working at a bar and a drunk guy came in, and he was the most terrifying thing on planet Earth is a human being. When you a human is the most terrifying being on Earth. And so that's why the villains in this thing are big humans or whatever. There's a way in which the reason AI is so terrifying is because it's so close to the human and it seems like it might be human, right? But then of course, Mother Teresa was a human, or some of the, people your best friends are humans, right? People who create some of the life that makes life worth living are humans, right? So it's very interesting how humans are both really great. They're the possibility of they create I thou possibly, or they can create, giant titans that are eating you or something. And the other thing I was going to say, I really like that point, Michelle, then Javier, that disembodied and embodied actually has a value judgment in it already. I think that's exactly right. That's really nice. I'm wondering, should it be here, there? Like here, there is like, because like if you're in a sucky situation, there is better than here, but if you're in paradise, here is better than there. I'm not sure. That's a very interesting point. Michelle.
Just a really quick point that's all of this has been great. I was thinking about like something that Javier has brought up in his great recent piece on the aporia of trust, is this idea that we like confuse the epistemological with the ontological, and often we have like the epistemological as actually predominant almost before the ontological. And I wonder if virtual space, internet, AI, even though these things are not all exactly the same, does actually cause us to make this mistake or conflation, like that we end up putting the epistemological before the ontological. Anyways, this is a little bit of it.
So I mean, I think it's very similar to what you're thinking, what you've been already thinking, Daniel. You call it ontoepistemology, right? But this question of AI, and people already brought it up, right? The searching function, the information functionality of it. You can already tell that we're concerned with knowing. And then the AI problem also becomes a problem of knowing. So already we are trapping ourselves in a epistemological issue that becomes ontological. But I've been curious about how to reorder that notion, because how do we put the ontology first, then the epistemology? Because it seems like, you know, this is like the hard thing that like I've been trying to wrap my mind around, because it's like you get in this weird argument with yourself where you're like, well, how can you even talk ontology if you don't have epistemology? And then how can you even like say all these things? I mean, I feel like Buber has really grounded me in the fact that like when we talk about concretion, it's extremely difficult. Like it's the fact that, you know, we're not just ever, I mean, when Buber talks about dialogue, it's something that like almost, it's so rare, you know, like this is not even a dialogue, this is a discussion, you know, like, but yeah, it almost reminds me of how Thomas Merton describes the fall with Buber's logic. How the fall was, one of the mistake of Adam and Eve was the fact that they were already good. They just wanted to know they were good. So this is the kind of ordering that I'm trying to present here, where it's that we need to try to not make that mistake of like, we need to put the ontology first prior to the epistemology. Of course we need epistemology, I'm not saying that we don't, but it just seems like, I think ironically, like what Dimitri said, that whole thing about like, oh, we're so worried about like being disembodied, right? It already becomes like an ethical demand to not be disembodied, but like who wants to be disembodied, right? But I feel like it's predicated, like AI is such an issue because we are anxious about our otherness being eradicated. It actually reminds me of Paul Tillich's Courage to Be, where he divides the three anxiety: ontological, spiritual, and moral. He already said that, I mean, I feel like he predicted right that we were falling into the more spiritual anxiety. And I think AI kind of reflects that anxiety about how it's going to eradicate our otherness. But I think the theology part of this is that man has always been described as in between. That's the difficult situation. Man is in between. And that is what, in my opinion, causes us extreme anxiety, is because I cannot tell at what point of extreme I am in, because I am in between. Like I can't even like think through this issue, because theologically I am an in-between being. You know, which is why we always talk about being and nothingness, being and nothingness, being. It's because we're in between. But yeah, those are my thoughts.
First off, it's almost like it's like Adam's naming the lion. He's like lion, and the lion looks back and says, Adam. And Adam's like, hey, you're not supposed to do that. I'm naming them here. And it's like, shut up, lion. So, it's something like that. There's another thought I had where it's interesting where in the past, if you said disembodied, it would have meant something like having your head cut off. Now disembodied means just being in your head. Like, it's interesting how there's almost a weird reversal that has happened historically. Like, before today, to be disembodied would mean you had your head cut off. Now it means just being a head on a stick, which I guess you have to have your head cut off to be a head on a stick now that I think about it. But, it's a different emphasis or something. Also, there's an interesting question. What Mr. Tillich, what would it mean to have the courage to be before the AI? What is the courage to be in the presence of the AI? I think it comes down to something about that apathetic nature where you say, no, I believe that human beings have some sort of deep apathetic nature that the AI does not capture. Even if I see nothing in my phenomenological experience, it gives me reason to think that humans are not replaceable by AI. I am still going to believe that there is some apathetic, the final absolute choice, as we talked about in that one Marion conversation, net 12 or something, is like the choice of no, I believe the human, I trust that there is something irreducible about the human that the AI cannot capture, even if the AI can do everything the human can do. And to trust in that and to make that your courage to be your ultimate concern by which you are standing by. And it seems like that's going to be really hard, though, because it's almost like the temptations. It's almost like a temptation. Now I'm thinking about all these like theology stories, Christian stories, temptations of Jesus in the desert, where you're going to be tempted to think that humans are replaceable by AI because you'll see no evidence that humans can do something AI cannot do. So it'll be like a temptation where Satan's in the wilderness and he's like, come on, guys, just accept the truth. You're replaceable. But you don't give in to that temptation. And of course, that almost now I'm thinking about Kierkegaard's absurdism, leap of faith. It's kind of an absurd act. You see no evidence that humans are not replaceable by AI, and yet you choose to take a leap of faith that there's some apathetic core, some sort of irreducible special core, if you grant me the word special, that you're going to trust in regardless of all the evidence. Gosh, there's that one movie where, oh yeah, it's the Return of the King. It's Lord of the Rings, where they bring out Frodo's armor, the mouth of Sauron, not the movie version of this sucked, but in the book it was great, where the mouth of Sauron brings out Frodo's outfit. And he's like, nah, we got Frodo to Aragorn. And there's zero reason for Aragorn to think that Frodo and Sam are okay. And yet he still chooses to fight and believe, even though there's zero evidence that they're okay. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that they're not okay. There's all the evidence in the world that they've been captured by Sauron, and yet Aragorn fights anyway. It's almost like you're going to have to do the same. Like AI is going to bring you all the evidence in the world that humans are replaceable by AI, and yet we're still going to have to keep fighting. And that would seem what it would mean to have the courage to be. But let me give it to Dimitri.
Yeah, so abstract seems disembodied and concrete seems more like embodied, right? Well, there's also things which can be too concrete. And in this new age spiritual movement, that there's some interesting stuff that's happening there. There's some people who totally go for this. I believe they want to be like animals, they want to go so concrete, like I once watched this interview with this guy, and a guy asked, yeah, what do you think about spirit, about God, about spirituality? And he's like, no, I just want to do breathing exercises, and I just want to live in the jungle and have no shoes on and like this. I don't have any ideas. Don't get to me with ideas. I just want to be an animal. And that's that's too concrete, man. Yeah, so I really like what you said, Daniel, and there is this great quote by Chesterton. A soldier surrounded by enemies, if he is to cut his way out, needs to combine a strong desire for living with a strange carelessness about dying. He must not merely cling to life, for then he will be a coward and will not escape. He must not merely wait for death, for then he will do suicide and will not escape. He must seek his life in a spirit of furious indifference to it. He must desire life like water and yet drink death like wine. And I think Chesterton really captures very well what you just put with, who was it, Aragon? yeah, thirst for life like water and drink death like wine when it comes.
Boom.
Death like wine. That's lovely. But no, I definitely, like, Kierkegaard has that point where basically without that kind of courage, and everything becomes experimentation and everything is a castle in the sky. Like, the modern man has this problem of a perpetual state of experimentation. There is no seriousness to everything. And basically, if we're going to have, it would seem as if to face AI and not be pathologically destroyed by it, like glimpsing a Lovecraft creature, because in Lovecraft, a very glimpse of the ancient one reduces you to ash or whatever. Like, it would seem as if in order to encounter AI and to see everything it can do without being reduced to ash, it will require not the experimental self that Kierkegaard's talking about, which is also going to be dealing with Chesterton, because he is talking about a self that is never committed to anything, that is not facing death, but he's always, everything has a certain shallowness by which you are engaging, and you're just going through the life being carried. That doesn't seem like it would cut it. It would require a certain seriousness, which would be a trust in the human, in the human having something special, that it cannot be lost, even if there's every reason in the world to think that it can be lost.
Yeah, so I think the AI basically proves my point, or at least I can argue my point more fully now, because if AI is going to basically control information, control knowledge, essentially, that already shows why we're so scared, because we've already stressed epistemology so much as our own ontology, as beings that know, right? Once AI proves that it can transcend our own capacity to know, what are we left with, right? We're left with our own ontology. We're left with our own being. And then this becomes a more stressful thing. And I think Tillich is right, that our courage to be is going to be presenting our being in the face of that. In the face of not knowing. I think ironically, because the AI will know, right? And of course, we can go through all these hypothetical arguments about like AI will know everything and what, all this doom stuff. But even if we emphasize the most doom ideology possible with AI, it will exemplify how much we don't know. And then we have nothing left but to present our being, and ironically, I think that is actually the most hopeful stance is the having that courage to present our being. But like Buber says, it's ironic because like Buber talks about how real faith is trust, and Tillich talks about how courage to be is faith as well, taking the courage. So there is something about how they overlap with each other, courage and trust. To have trust is already beginning to take courage, as I already wrote before about the aporia of trust. That it ironically we're already on the ground of mistrust from the beginning, and yet we deeply want to trust. So there is a kind of leap. There's a kind of Kierkegaardian leap that we have to take: trust, courage, present our being in the face of not knowing, in the face of no longer having the possession of knowing, if that is what AI threatens us with in the end, if that is what the hypothetical stance is. But yeah.
No, magnificently put, and I've enjoyed this very, very much. To your point on faith, I don't actually know if you can understand, say, the book of Romans if you translate faith not as faithful. Like if I were to say I have faith in you, Javier, that would not mean I believe you exist. Everyone would know that does not mean I believe you exist. It means I can trust you. Like when faith came to believe to be assent to the existence of an abstract entity, then it lost the faithful dimension. But if you go through Romans, like when the Bible talks about faith in Christianity, for example, the word faith is tied to loyalty, it is tied to trust, and it's lost all of that. So that's led us to being very confused, because only the modern thinks that you can believe something that you won't die for. Like that's a modern invention. The notion of belief that you won't that you won't take risk in, that's very modern. And it emerges because you suddenly started encountering people with different beliefs. So you needed a word to describe, oh, you believe in Hinduism, I believe in Christianity, right? But when you lived in just a Christian society, you didn't need a word to position you relative to other people's abstract beliefs. You see what I'm saying? So you didn't have to say, I believe in Christianity to designate the worldview you're situated in. Well, once we started needing meaning, belief, and faith that way, we lost the original meaning, which for Paul has a lot to do with loyalty and faithful and courage, and we have to redeem that. To close, the other thing, like basically, yes, we will not find the resources to deal with the problem of AI in neo-pragmatism, Richard Rorty, trolley problem experience. Like philosophy today after postmodernity is epistemology. There is no ontology. Epistemology cannot do anything for us. And you will not find a philosophy that emphasizes epistemology and mental models without any ontology to be able to stand against AI in the sense of what is the value of the human. Now, I am not saying that I think modernity and postmodernity does not add value, because in fact, the loss of like mental models, like sucky epistemology is bad. However, you got to have both, right? And that's why I'm so interested in the counter-modern enlightenment, as I call it, because that is a strain of thinking. If you go all the way back to Vico, you could even say, going up through the counter-enlightenment, Scottish enlightenment, obviously science of logic, Blondel, Korobowski, Flood, all of these different people, that is a strain of philosophical thought that saves ontology. And it does it, of course, by making onto-epistemology, where you put them together. That's what we have to redeem. Theology has generally done a better job of that because it's kind of been forced to. Like if you believe that there exists a God that's metaphysical and creates you, well, you're always dealing with some form of ontology. Now, in a lot of theology departments, they're stuck in something that the great Joel will call cohericism, which is the notion of we ascribe to axioms and we just believe in the system, even if we can't prove it corresponds to anything. And that's not going to necessarily work. And I have to explain that in The Truism of the Rational. And Joel has done lovely work on that as well. So theology has not pulled the weight that it needs to pull to provide these resources. But I think your assessment of the need to redeem ontology, if you will, which one redeems it or sublates it into onto-epistemology, is basically the name of the game. Because if we're not able to do it, then AI is going to be a Lovecraft creature. But if we are able to do it, it may just be an invitation into the dance of a beatific vision, but that will be up to us.